if you will turn in your Bibles to the 6th chapter, the book of Esther, as we continue our study through the Word. So you'll remember how it was that Esther became queen. She was selected in a beauty contest, and now she is the queen. And you'll remember that Haman is this individual who gets promoted, but Mordecai, who is the uncle to Queen Esther, and Mordecai and Haman do not get along with one another, and Haman becomes the most powerful person, second now to the king, and he is upset because Mordecai will not give him homage, will not bow down to him. And so he desires to destroy Mordecai. And so he comes up with a plan to go to the king and to tell him that there is a group of rebellious people that do not keep the laws of the land, and that they really, your kingdom would be much better if we just wiped them out. And I'm happy to not only wipe them out for you, but to make a large donation to the treasury. I will take their possessions and I will donate them into the treasury, so you end up without a problem and enriched. And you remember that, so Haman comes offering this bribe, and the king tells Haman that he's not interested in the bribe and the money, but go ahead and remove that which is causing a disruption in the kingdom. And so you remember that Haman then goes and writes a letter that tells all the provinces, all of the governors that on a certain day that they are to destroy all of the Jews and to plunder all of their goods. And this now, he has the signet ring of the king, and he puts it on and he sends it out. And so this becomes irrevocable. And you remember what happened is that these were posted now throughout the entire Persian Empire, and in Shushan, the capital where Queen Esther lived and where Mordecai lived also. And when they read that, when Mordecai read that, he just wept and he mourned. And you remember that he then goes and sends word to Esther of the situation that is going on. And you remember that he tells Esther, Esther, you need to go in to the king. And you remember what Esther's response was, is that you just don't go into the king. It doesn't just work like that. I haven't been able to see him or get a text message off to him in 30 days. We've had no communication whatsoever. And if I go in unannounced and he does not hand the golden scepter to me, then I will perish. And you remember what Mordecai says to her. He says, don't think that you're going to be safe inside of these palace walls. They will not save you. He says, but if you do not stand up and take action right now, he says, deliverance will come to the Jews, but you and your father's house will perish. And so he says, what do you think? But that you have come for just such a time as this. You've come into this place. God's raised you up into this position for just this moment in time. And so you'll remember that Esther then agrees that she will go in. And she says, if I perish, I perish. But I'm not going to go in without a spiritual covering. And so she asks Mordecai to have everybody outside of the palace fasting and praying for 3 days. She and her handmaidens would also fast and pray for 3 days. And then at the end of the 3 days, she would go in to the king. And so the 3 days come and go, and you remember how she now gets arrayed in her royal robes, and she goes now to the court of the king. And you remember that she stands outside now of the palace. And so when the king saw her, he places his golden scepter towards her, and she comes and humbly touches it. And he says, what is it that you desire? And she says, I want to throw a banquet, and I want you and Haman to come to it. And later today, and so the king is delighted, and so he says absolutely yes. And then Haman is summoned to this banquet with just the king and the queen. And you'll remember that afterwards the king asks her now, as he has come to the banquet, what is your petition? Up to half of my kingdom, ask anything that you want. And she says, I want you to come to a banquet tomorrow. And then I'll make my petition then. And I want Haman there as well. And so the king says yes. And so they are going to have a banquet the next day. And you remember that Haman then goes home after he's just had this private banquet with the queen and the king, just the two of them. And he's so honored by having had this particular, banquet where nobody else was invited, just him and the king. But as he leaves, as he's going, by the gates of the city, there's Mordecai, and Mordecai will not bow down to him. And you remember that it just made him so mad, but he maintained his composure, self-control, and he gets home, gathers his wife and his friends, and tells them how much the king honored him, and tells them all of the blessings that he's had, and the kids that he's had, the wealth that he has. He just brags. But he is really upset by Mordecai. And so the suggestion was to just go into the king and ask him to be hanged. And so that made Haman very happy. And so he decided to build the gallows 50 cubits high, this 75-foot tower, just to hang Mordecai on. He wanted it very high so that everybody could see Mordecai. And so he goes to bed happy. He's excited. He's got a plan in his hand. He knows that he is going to get to go to a banquet tomorrow with the king and the queen. That's a special honor. And he is going to ask that Mordecai gets to be hanged. And so he is excited. And so that is where we saw that it left off last time. And so it is time now for the banquet in the following day, and that's really where Esther chapter 6 is going to start. But there is this interlude between these two banquets. It's interesting how we're going to see a continual theme in Esther is God's providential hand, and how God just moves us around. He raises up kings and takes down kings, and he positions us for just such a time as this. And we're going to see that in the nighttime now, the king is going to have a sleepless night. And so he is restless and gets out of bed, and in order to just pass the time, he's going to have the chronicles of the history read to him, of the notes from the court, and he's going to discover that there was a kindness that was forgotten, and he is going to remedy it. And we're going to see the irony of the timing now of all of these events as they transpire. And for us, so oftentimes in our lives, the details in our lives don't make sense. The timing of events in our lives don't always make sense. And as we're walking through them in our life, in lifetime, we can't understand exactly what God is doing. But what I want you to know for absolute certainty is God is knitting a tapestry out of your life. And he's pulling on the different threads, and he's pushing through the timelines that are there. I think of Esther, and I think, she gets them to the banquet, and then all of a sudden, the king asks her, what do you want? And she's gotten Haman there, and all of a sudden, she just asks for another banquet the next day. And I wondered if afterwards, all night, she's saying to herself, why did I do that? Why did I just stop? And you know how we can just get down on ourselves for a decision? You ever say something you wish you didn't say, or make a decision you wish you didn't make, and you're like, why did I do that? Why did I say that? I don't even know why. Everything was ready. The king was there, and I froze, And it's like, no, you didn't freeze at all. The Lord paused you right in there, because there was something else that needed to happen in order for everything to be ready in the timeline. And how God works supernaturally through the natural. God works supernaturally through the natural. And so here we see how God is weaving everything together in the background now to be able to deliver his people. And so we begin here in this 6th chapter, the book of Esther, and it says, that night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And so here we see that they were the guards that were outside of his bedchamber, outside of his bedroom. And these were the guards that were now having a conspiracy to execute him and to kill him. And so Mordecai had discovered the plot and had told Esther, and then Esther told the king, and then the king had investigated and found out that the plot was true. And those 2 had been executed. And so that event made it into the records. And so here's the king. He is sleepless, and we see that now all of a sudden he has them read. In verse 3 it says, then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And so we see that this was 5 years earlier that these events had transpired. And we see that at the exact proper moment, God providentially intervened so that the king suffers insomnia now, calls for the books, reads of Mordecai's unrewarded deed 5 years ago, and desires to reward him and wants to bless him now for that service and for saving his life. And no doubt I wonder here also about, Mordecai himself. He saves the king's life. He delivers, the information to Esther, and Esther gives it to the king and saves his life, and then nothing happens, for Mordecai. And I wonder how many times Mordecai was like, man, thought I was going to get a bonus, for that one there. Thought something was going to happen. I got nothing. His friends are like, nothing? No, nothing. I didn't even get a diploma, or anything. I got nothing, And so but it was customary. I mean, when there was a wonderful act that had been done, that the king was generous in rewarding that. That was common in the Persian Empire. And so you have this disappointment of Mordecai that's 5 years old. You have Esther that suddenly, for no apparent reason whatsoever, freezes and decides that she needs another banquet the next day. And all of these events transpire just so that the king now can suffer this insomnia. In verse 4, so the king said, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So the king now is wanting to honor Mordecai, and in comes Haman, who wants to get him hanged now. So he's in there early. He's the only one that's there. He's excited about getting his revenge on Mordecai. So there's nobody else in the court. Again, we see the providence in action here of leading. He couldn't wait until morning to get that permission. And the king's servants said to him, Haman is there standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. And so the king brings Haman in for an entirely different reason than what Haman supposed. So Haman comes and he can't wait to see the king. And he gets there. There's nobody else there. And suddenly the servants say, hey, the king wants to see you. And Haman's like, perfect. My day, this is zippity-doo-dah. This is a good day. This could not be going any better. I'm getting this knocked out right before I have my banquet, get all my work done here. And so the king says, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And so now here Haman thinks that the king is indirectly asking, because Haman is the prime minister. He is the most powerful person in second. And so, the king asks, how can I really honor somebody before the people if I, that would delight my heart? And so Haman, here we see that, number one, he's prevented from speaking about the king, about his business, because the king instantly starts by asking him now a question. So the reason that he wanted to come and see the king gets tabled for a moment. And now we see that Haman, who is so self-centered, that he never once thought that the man the king wanted to honor could be anyone except himself. So we see the self-absorption now of Haman. And it says in verse 7, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. So here he is, just envisioning himself in this royal robe, sitting on one of the king's horses that the king has actually ridden on, that has a crest on it. And so this is what he sees in his mind. He says in verse 9, then let his robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Wink, wink. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so seat him on this horse, and then take the most noble of the princes and have him be the one that goes around and declares the honor of the person that is on the horseback. And here we see what's interesting is how much Haman craved now the respect from his peers and from the crowd at large. He doesn't ask for wealth. He had plenty of money. Notice that. He doesn't ask for any reward. What he wants is he wants the adulation and the respect of the people. He wants them to worship him. And it's interesting because that's the very sin that entered into the heart of Satan himself. That pride now. He wanted to be like the king. He wanted everybody to bow down to him the way that they bowed down to the king. And so we see how that pride now enters in. And the Bible tells us that pride goes before what? Man, before a fall, when you become prideful now, when you start to exalt yourself, when you want everybody to sing your praises, man, that is when you are going to go down. And so here we see that now Haman tells the king what he sees in his mind for the best way the king could honor somebody that he delights in. And then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. And by the way, you're the one that gets to lead him around the city now and tell everybody to honor him because he's the one that delights the king. Now you remember that he was going to ask for the king to hang him. That was what he came there for. That was what was on his heart. And now suddenly he is the one that has to go. And so the irony of this, but he who is the one that he hates, he has to honor. And now he was the one that wanted respect from Mordecai, and now he's the one that has to give the respect to Mordecai in front of everybody as he leads him around and honors him publicly. And so, verse 11, so Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Haman had to carry out the king's command, even though it embarrassed and angered him probably to no end whatsoever. And afterward, verse 12, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And so he has a bad morning, I mean, he thought he was going to have a great morning. He was all excited for it. And suddenly now it just turns into probably the worst morning of his entire life. He goes home mourning. He is grieving over his own absolute humiliation. Now, here's the interesting thing. He's the only one that thinks that he's humiliated, because the king hadn't asked him to do anything that was humiliating. It was just honor somebody that has done a favor for the king. And so as a prince, to go and to lead someone around and to have that privilege to do that before the people, there was no dishonor in what the king had asked him to do. But it was so personally humiliating to him that we see that it was like coals that were on his own head. So he is personally, privately grieved. It's interesting how earlier Mordecai had publicly grieved over the people. And here we see that Haman is privately grieving over his own humiliation. You see how Mordecai had a heart for the people, and we see that Haman only is interested in himself. When Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." So, in case his day wasn't going bad enough as it was, now his wife tells him, "Oh, you're not going to succeed." And his wise men and friends around him tell him that he's not going to succeed either. The Persian religions made an awful lot over omens and signs and fate and chance and luck and all of these things. And so it's interesting that they are reading the writing on the wall, but the reality is that neither Haman nor any other human can possibly stand against God's people. God said that he will bless those who bless his people, and that he will curse and judge those that come against his people. And so we see that the Jewish nation now, which was back into their land again, they had gone back in, they had their temple rebuilt, and they are offering sacrifices while this is taking place. In verse 14, it says, "While they were still talking with them, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet, which Esther had prepared." So Haman was excited to go to the banquet before. Now he doesn't probably even want to go to the banquet, but it's the time for the banquet. And so the servants come to now call him to the banquet. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Now, he had a night of insomnia. And so he was having those chronicles read to him. But how many times do you think that he was wondering what the queen's request was going to be? I mean, certainly it had to have piqued his curiosity. And she said, "Come to the banquet, I'm going to tell you." He comes to the banquet and she says, "No, I'll tell you tomorrow. Come to another banquet." He's like, "Come on, you're killing me here. You know, I want to know, what is it? I am so curious as to what all of this buildup is." Queen Esther has never acted like this before. She's never done anything like this before. But boy, now she's got something. She's up to something, and he is really curious. And so it is now the second day of the banquet, and there they are gathered, and they are celebrating. And now finally the king's like, "Okay, that's it. Time's up. You got to tell me, what is it your petition? It'll be done. I will grant it to you." And then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed and to be annihilated. And had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." And so here we see that Esther goes right to the point, and she gave her petition and her request. She was asking for her life to be spared and the life of her people. And no doubt it is clear now that her nationality. You'll remember that Mordecai had said, "Don't declare your nationality." And now we see that there is the revelation here. And so we see that she says that if we were just going to be sold into slavery, she wouldn't have even bothered the king. But it is that their very lives now are going to be destroyed. And so King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" If you're Haman right about now, and you're hearing the king say this, and suddenly you realize that the queen is Jewish, and that you're the one that wrote the edict that got sent throughout the entire Persian Empire, and the king is saying, "How dare somebody do that? Where is that person?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." And so Haman was terrified before the king and queen. We see that the king asks the question, who is he and where is he? And who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And now we see that Esther calls him out. And the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And so the king rises up and goes out into his palace and garden. And there is great speculation as to why did the king do that. And I think that the best of the solutions that I saw was that the king was trying to figure out a way to spare Esther and her people. He rises up in anger and he wants to just go clear his head and try and figure a way out of this. The edict that he had signed, that the signet ring had been given to Haman on, in the Persian culture and empire, once an edict was given, it could not be revoked. And so there was an irrevocable edict that had been given that now put his queen in jeopardy and all the Jewish people, and he just now recognizes that that's what happened. That's what happened when he gave him the signet ring, when Haman had disguised the true intention of what was happening and had just talked about the people as this small group of rebellious people. But now the king recognizes the severity of it. And so the king now has walked and comes back in verse 8. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. And then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? And so he's thrown himself across the couch petitioning here, and the king sees that as she is in too close of proximity. Remember, no one came near. The men and the women were not in the same places. The women would have their own, the men would have their own. And so for even him to have access to be in the presence of the queen was rare. And so here he is across the couch. And so here now we see the king is even more upset. And as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. And then the king said, hang him on it. Now, here we see that it's possible that Haman had ruffled the feathers of the people that were around him, that he was so focused on wanting everybody to bow down to him and all that he had made some enemies. And so here suddenly, Harbona, he's got, insight as to what's been happening. He's aware of the gallows that have been built. And so he just kind of floats the idea out before the king, that, hey, by the way, Haman has gallows that he had made for Mordecai. Remember, he's the one that you wanted to honor here now. And so the king's like, hang him on it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's wrath subsided. And so we see that the king's wrath has subsided, but there is still a major problem. And that major problem is the edict that the king had already given. And so, verse 1, and on that day, King Ahasuerus, chapter 8, gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. And so the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. And so we see that Mordecai now is exalted into the position of prime minister. And we see that he is given the signet ring now of the king. We see that the house of Haman, this refers to his estate. We see that this estate now passes over to the custody of the crown. That was Persian law. And so if a person was a traitor, then their possessions were confiscated. And so they were now taken and appointed. Now the king gives them to Queen Esther. And so we see here that they are blessed. Verse 3, now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So we see she goes back a second time now. And she goes to the court unannounced and falls upon his mercy, and with tears before him is begging him to do something to help her people, as her people now are going to perish. And so counteract the evil of Haman. And so the king grants the scepter to her. And so Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, Let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? And so here we see that Esther now begs the king to revoke now the decree that has been set forth. But the king can't revoke that decree. But he comes up with another solution. In verse 7, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman. And they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. And so here we see that you cannot revoke or alter what has already been written. But a second decree that can be written that would kind of invalidate that first one, that can be done. So writing a second decree, this now would be the solution. And so the king instructs Mordecai and Queen Esther to go and to write the decree and to stamp it with his signet ring. And the weight of this second one would carry all the same weight as that first one did, but it would be able to mitigate the results of that first one. So what do you do? This edict had been given that everybody could attack the Jews and take their possessions. That was the edict that had been written on the first one. And so what would the second edict be that Esther and Mordecai would come up with that would mitigate that? And so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. What an undertaking it is to send a message out to the entire kingdom, to have all of the languages transcribed and written down and documented, sealed, and then sent off. But here we see that this is what is done. In verse 11, and by these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And so here we see that the edict had been given that the people were to go and to plunder the Jews. But here in this second one, we see that it tells that the Jews can arm themselves and now fight back. And so who wants to go plunder people that are going to fight back? And so here we see that this is now the strategy, that they're to arm themselves and to make proper defenses here. And it says in verse 13, and a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And the couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened, and pressed on by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. And so now we see the document goes out, and then the decree now was issued in Shushan, and that is where we see Mordecai and Esther. Verse 15. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Mordecai now is presented before the people, and he is dressed in royal attire, and he receives a joyful welcome from the people in the city. And we see that the people in the city were made up of both the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews were only a small part of the population, but Mordecai was well liked. Remember, he used to sit in the gates of the city, and the residents of the city now rejoiced that Mordecai had been appointed as a prime minister. In verse 16, and the Jews had light and gladness, and joy and honor. What a beautiful verse that is. Look at now the end result of all of this. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. I want you to know that that's a picture of the future of every child of God. Of every child of God. That we are going to dwell in heaven. And it says that the Jews had light. Jesus is the what? Man, he is the light of the world. And so the glory of the light, that in heaven there'll be no sun or moon, because the glory of God himself will be the light. And we will be in the light for all eternity. And so the Jews had light and gladness, and the gladness that we will have in heaven. How glorious is that going to be when we enter into that presence, the gladness of the presence of God, and joy. What joy is there that waits for us in heaven, and honor. It says that we are going to be given rewards, that we are going to be honored for the service that we gave here upon this earth. Whenever there is a military funeral, there is the playing of taps, and there is the honor guard that comes in with an American flag that is then unfolded and folded back up again, and then is presented to the family with a thank you from our nation for their service to our country. Our country honors those people that have served our nation. And so also will we be honored in heaven for the service that we have given for the kingdom of God here upon this earth. It says that we are going to be rewarded at the bema seat of Christ, and then we will take all the honor that we have been given, and we will then put it at the feet of Jesus and cast all of our crowns now before the one who is truly worthy of all glory and honor. But what a beautiful picture of what waits for us. Heaven. God tells us to continue to keep looking up, to keep being reminded of where we are, that we're pilgrims right now, and we are passing through. We see how God works all things together for good. Even though there is difficulty in the struggle, and even though there is adversity in the path, we see that we are overcomers, and that God is the one that is writing his story and weaving together our lives. He is the one that is creating the interactions that you have at the supermarkets and in the lines, and those accidental occurrences that take place that are not coincidence in any way, shape, or form, but they are orchestrated by God. So oftentimes the places of our work are not employment, they're the mission field that God has placed you in, so that you can be there to be rubbing alongside of those people that have divine appointments with you for just such a time as when their life begins to fall apart and and turn and ask those questions there. You've been placed where you are. It's not an accident that you are where you are. And God has a plan for your life if we would just allow him now to more fully direct us no matter where we are. God is navigating through the Spirit and connecting all of the pieces together. And so here we see this glorious picture. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. It says in verse 17, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had what? Joy. And? Gladness. Joy and gladness. Joy and gladness. That is the heart that God, of what he has for us. Joy. Joy is that incredible experience that passes now circumstance. It is the safety and security that we feel, and our soul is connected to God, who will never leave us and will never drop us and will never forsake us and will never leave us behind. That security that we have of being loved now by our Creator and the hope of heaven, this is what gives us joy and gladness. There are times of celebration. There are times when things are going our way. And there are the holidays and the celebrations and the festivities that we get to enjoy. And so we get joy, which is not circumstantial. And then added to it, we also have those circumstances as well that are celebrations. And so joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. And then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So what an amazing outcome to Haman's hatred for the Jews. What happens? They now suddenly there is this evangelization of the Persian Empire that takes place because of now the favor that fell upon the Jews, and now the fear of God came upon them. And we see here how God uses all different circumstances. What looked like absolute tragedy, what looked like devastation, that proclamation, what did it cause in Mordecai? It caused him to go weeping and mourning in sackcloth as this incredible trial that gripped his soul entered in. But what happened? God saw him through that trial, delivered him out of it, and we see the expansion of the kingdom and the glory of God is the outcome of that trial. And so also does God want to give you victory through your trial. And God wants to be able to make his name great in your life and in the people that are around you as we seek to go through those hardships and those difficulties, trusting in the Lord, being willing now to rise up and to let God lead you, as Esther would say, I will go into the king, and if I perish, I perish. If we are consumed by doing God's will here upon this earth, then we are consumed doing the will of God in our lives. And so that beautiful commitment to trust God, let God be God. We'll walk by faith, and we will watch the outcome of his story. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Lord, thank you for the way that you continue to move, Lord, in our hearts and in our lives and in unexpected ways sometimes. But Lord, nonetheless, you are on the throne. Everything is unfolding exactly as you said that it would. And so, Father, we pray that tonight you would comfort us if we are in a place of affliction, if we are in a place of difficulty or hardship, knowing that, God, you have a plan, even through this, if we will just continue to press forwards, seeking your face, and, Lord, being led by your Spirit. So, God, help us, bless us, Lord, minister to us. In Jesus' holy and precious name we pray. Amen.